Welcome back, everyone. We've had a slight change in our schedule, and we're going to be welcoming Dr. Todd Cunningham to speak next. Um, there is a section of the OHRC report, of course, that refers to, that is related to accommodations and psychoeducational assessments. Todd, of course, is our local expert in that. Todd is a registered psychologist in Ontario. He's also an assistant professor at the University of Toronto and is chair of the school and clinical child psychology program there. Dr. Cunningham specializes in conducting psychoeducational assessments and treating mental health challenges such as anxiety and mood-related disorders, attention difficulties, and complex trauma. His area of expertise is in working with children and learning disabilities and using assistive technology. Welcome, Todd.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. I'm just going to pop up my screen here. And at the end of this, I will send out the link to today's slide, so you don't have to worry about if you don't capture everything as I'm talking. So first, I want to thank the Ontario branch of the International Dyslexic Association for having me here today and for allowing me to be part of this fantastic symposium looking at the right to read. Now, school is a key place that individuals come to learn the values, knowledge, and skills needed to be productive members of our societies. We help to develop our understanding of each other through learning about diversity, equity, inclusions, and the impacts of colonialism. We learn how to socialize and work in groups. We develop content knowledge as well as we develop our key academic skills. And as we've been talking about today, one of those key areas of academic skills is the area of literacy. And as we've heard this morning, literacy, or even reading and writing, aren't just unified skills. They're actually multiple skills that have to come together to allow an individual to read and write. And kind of like the Snowling's rope model of reading, our kind of pyramid model of reading really shows the importance of paying attention to the oral language components, but also the text structures within our language that have to come together to allow a person to be able to read and write fluently. Now, I like the pyramid model because it shows me that there is a kind of a hierarchical or a hierarchy of how these skills develop. I can't start developing my reading comprehension skills very well if I don't first learn my sounds and how those associate to the symbols that represent them and develop my ability to read accurately and fluently in connected text. So this is a key piece in the development that we have. Same with writing. We don't have our fundamental skills in place, then we can't expect a student to be able to do the higher order skills. So when it comes to students with learning disabilities in the area of word reading or dyslexia, what the science had shown, and Dr. Gadd was great at kind of pointing out the neuroscience here, is that the real underlying weakness to this kind of learning profile is the difficulties of learning the association between spoken and written symbols, or spoken words or spoken sounds and written symbols that are required for the process of developing reading, writing, and arithmetic. And so it is that kind of highway on the side of her brain that she was showing that connects this ability to recognize the symbols, translate those into the sounds, and then later lead to the ability to see and know what the words are. And so for students who have learning disabilities in the word reading or dyslexia, we know that the fundamental issue is right down here. This knowing the 44 sounds within English and associating those to those 26 letters that make up our alphabet and the other combination of graphs that go along the way to be able to allow a student to start to learn how to recognize those symbols, as well as the rules that go into being able to put those together to know what the words are. And then later being able to read and recognize those words fluently and accurately. And so when we have a weakness down here, then that has a direct impact on our higher skills above. So what can we do to support students then? Well, there's a bunch of things that are laid out in the Right to Read in terms of how we need to go about helping students. The first one that we've been hearing about all morning is the Tier 1 instruction, how important it is for us to have explicit and evidence-based classroom instructions for all students in the area of reading, starting in kindergarten and going through. So that Tier 1 approach, that regular classroom, is a key part of our intervention. That's where we start. But through good systematic screening happening in kindergarten, happening throughout their early years, and progress monitoring that would go on along with it, we're going to identify students early that are going to not be meeting those kind of target in their development. And so therefore, we need to then move into our second interventions, which is remediation. And remediation is targeting and strengthening the underlying skill. So if I'm unable to decode words, it's teaching me how to do that so that I can meet that kind of developmental expectation and have that skill develop so that I can use it to develop my next skill, which is oral reading fluency and so forth. So remediation is about targeting the area of challenge and building that skill level up so that it is functional and I can continue to use it to continue to learn. But for some students, unfortunately, haven't been able to get that early intervention and haven't developed those kind of critical skills to the level that we need them to be so that they can engage into the day-to-day learning. Or other students, maybe they got early remediation, but because the challenge of work continues to increase over time, maybe the kind of the hints of the underlying language sound association weaknesses are starting to show themselves again. Often we see this in high school or university where the amount of reading each night just kind of gets bigger and bigger and bigger to a point where certain students with the word reading disabilities or dyslexia aren't able just to keep up with that. And that's where our accommodations come in. Accommodations are not about fixing the underlying weaknesses. It's about bypassing that underlying weakness to allow the student to continue to engage in the learning activities happening in their classroom or in their life, but also it allows them to develop those higher order skills. So we bypass a lower skill to allow the development of higher order skills. And I'll talk more about that in a couple of minutes. And the last thing that we have, which is the most can be overall impairing one, is our area of modification, where we say for some individuals, we say, okay, due to the level of challenge that we have, or due to the complexity of your learning profile, or due to, unfortunately, maybe not enough resources or time available to us, we need you to keep trying to engage in the school and engage in some sort of learning. And so we're going to modify our expectations of you. We're going to change the grade curriculum expectations and lower those to a place that your students able to engage in that. Or we are going to say, instead of looking at 5 kind of curriculum expectations this in the literacy program, let's say we're only going to look at 2 or 3 because that allows us to give more repetition to build up. So modification is the last kind of resort that we have in our intervention toolkit. But let me first get into these areas a bit more. So when it comes to remediation, we've been hearing all about some really fantastic products out there in programs and systematic areas. When we look at the research around what makes up a good remediation program, we know that like from the evidence, it has to be a targeted remediation. So if we have difficulties in the phonological processing or letter sound associations, we have to target those areas, or we have to target the development of reading comprehension strategies. We need targeted approaches that are actually targeting the specific academic skill that is impaired. Then we have to have a sequence of steps on how to take a student from where that weakness is and build them up so that we can get them back into a functional level so that they can use that skill to continue on in their learning. Often to be able to do this, we need drill with repetition and direct feedback where we're practicing, the student's getting to practice the skill over and over again and giving the student a lot of feedback so that their brain can start to see and learn how to develop that skill. Plus, we have to control the level of difficulty. We don't want it too hard. We don't want to have students become frustrated in the learning so that they disengage in the process. So we have to control that level of difficulty. And for some, this is a very sensitive piece. Often we push our students a little too hard, or in some cases, we don't push them hard enough. They become bored and disengaged that way. Often to be able to do these pieces, we do need smaller groups, kind of 4 to 8 students to manage the amount of direct practice that's going on. As well as we have to teach them metacognitive strategies, higher order strategies to know about how to pull apart a multisyllabic word into smaller units so that they can kind of tackle each of those units one at a time. The metacognitive strategies helps a student to take control of the level of challenge that they're running into. So they have an idea of approaching more and more complex tasks and breaking them down into small chunks. And the last thing we need to do is attribution retraining. Students who have reading challenges, writing challenges, dyslexia, often have very low academic self-concept. They see that everybody else around them can do the work that they cannot do. And that has an impact on how they view themselves as learners. The effort that they put forth, they don't see in return in the kind of the marks and the skill development that they have. And so attribution retraining is where we work with the student to actually praise themselves about the effort that they're going for, recognizing that they're developing the skills so that they can be able to read more independently and that they are, through their effort, are becoming better students. Now, when we take kind of this idea of the key ingredients on how to teach reading, again, there's not one program out there that actually kind of fulfills all the parts. Even our kind of gold standard tier 3 program to be able to help with kind of the foundations of reading, teaching the foundations of reading, only teaches the foundations of reading. Often what we need to do is we need to layer interventions so that as a student kind of masters the foundation, learns how to do word reading, then we're bringing another intervention to be able to develop their oral reading fluency or their reading fluency, and then another intervention to be able to develop their reading comprehension, as well as we're thinking about vocabulary development and also making sure that we're engaging the student by connecting their learning to their lived experiences, and so that they feel that their lived experiences are being represented in what they're doing. So intervention is actually very complicated. Remediation is very complicated. It's just not one thing. It's a whole host of things that we need to do and ensure that we're layering those on. And the same thing for reading is the same thing for writing. I know in the chat earlier on, there was like spelling, what about spelling? Spelling is an important piece in terms of teaching reading, and programs such as the Words Their Way that teaches family of words and using word sorts to help students to recognize the orthographic patterning within words are really, really important. Now, again, to be able to ensure that we're moving a student through a proper remediation phase as we're into a kind of a tier 2 or tier 3, we can't just be doing the programs. We also need to be monitoring how are they developing. And that's why we have the wonderful world of the curriculum baseline measures, these wonderful screening and progress monitoring tools that are developmentally appropriate for the different stages of reading. So we have different tools for different stages of reading. And that way we can screen as early as kind of pre-kindergarten to kindergarten for students who are at risk of developing reading failure in the future, and continue to monitor students over time to see if their skills are actually developing. And when we have them in an intervention, then we can also monitor their progress over time by doing weekly or bi-weekly kind of check-ins on those specific academic skills that we are targeting. We can actually see, is the student making the types of gains that we want them to be making, or are they not? And if they're not making the gains that we'd expect them to make, then we need to change up the intervention, either by intensifying it, repeating, going back a bit to kind of look at it, or looking at the intervention itself to ensure that this is the right intervention. But when we know that we're doing early screening and we know that we're doing good evidence-based intervention, especially at the tier 2, tier 3, we know that we can have profound impacts on students' reading abilities. This is some wonderful research that was done. This research was done with looking at remediation studies that were looking at students who were in the bottom 5% of readers out there, so the most severe readers. What they did in the study is they looked at kind of using a gold standard reading remediation program, either at grade 1 or starting it at grade 2 or starting it at grade 3. So all groups got the same intervention. All groups got it for the same duration of time. The only difference is what grade did the students get at. And the numbers here is the percentage of students who now meet the average ability. So we have remediated the reading disability. So they are now at average abilities for reading. So when it comes to grade 1, if we start remediation in grade 1 using gold standard approaches, we can get to 76 to 77% of a word reading and decoding skills at the students no longer meet the criteria for having a weakness there. They're at grade level. If we wait to start on the same program in grade 2, we only have kind of a 50% response to the intervention to get to typical levels. And if we wait to grade 3, we're only between 21 to 38% of students are now meeting grade level expectations. So it's really important to start early. Early intervention is essential for changing the path of development for these students as they go through our education system. They're acquiring the skill essential so that they can engage in more learning later on. Now, for some students, they haven't been able to get this early intervention, or for other students, what we see is later on, we see the weaknesses beginning to present themselves again when they're having difficulties. And that's where accommodations come in. Accommodations are not meant to replace remediations. They're meant to kind of help to support the remediation that's taking place or allow for more higher order remediation to be able to engage. Unfortunately, when we look at kind of some of the EQAO research, and this was really kind of brought to light through the report Lifting the Currents on the EQAO scores, we often see that accommodations are being used almost in replacement of good remediation. So this is the grade 3 EQAO data from 2005 to 2019. And what we can see in the general is that we have an increasing number of students who are passing the EQAO based on the use of accommodations, either technology or non-technology accommodations. Now, this is really striking when we look at students who are on IEPs in grade 3 EQAO data. We can see a significant increase in the ability of students using these accommodations to be able to pass. And what this tells me is a student in grade 3 still is within the window of being able to develop proficient reading skills if given the right types of remediation, but instead what we're doing is we're skipping remediation and we're going to more of an accommodated approach to be able to enable these students, and that unfortunately leads to longer term effects down the way. So accommodations is not a replacement for remediation. So what accommodations are is they are the ability to target certain skills. So one of the main accommodations is assistive technology. Now, assistive technology is any technology from my pencil to a computer. It's any technology allows me to maintain or improve my level of functioning if I have a disability. And with the disability is a really important piece part of this definition, because in fact, I think all of us are using assistive technology today in some form. Like, how many of you talk to Siri or Google on a daily basis to find out like the weather? Well, if you are, you're using voice recognition technology, which was originally developed, well, it was originally developed for lawyers, and then the LD community kind of hijacked it, and now everybody's using it. If you ever use that kind of autocorrect or word prediction on your phone, well, that's called word prediction. That was originally developed for students with like spelling disabilities to be able to accurately be able to write on the computer. If you ever listen to Google or your GPS talk to you, that's using text-to-speech software, which was originally developed for blind people. Dyslexic students now use it a lot, but now we're all using it. So in many cases, the technology that we all use today is the same technology that we actually need for students who have areas of weakness. It's just the difference is that we're using it to target a specific skill. And this is really important in our conceptualization. Because when we say that we're targeting a specific skill, what we're saying is I am not using that when it comes to a student who has oral reading fluency, then I'm using like a text-to-speech program just to work around that specific skill. Or if I'm having, let's say, writing difficulties, spelling difficulties, I'm using word prediction or spell check to target that specific skill. These are not necessarily meant to be able to correct all of the problems. Text-to-speech does not correct all the problems within reading. It only corrects one specific area. And in fact, the most latest studies around text-to-speech show that it actually has a very low impact on reading comprehension on its own. Just because the computer is reading out loud to me does not necessarily mean I'm increasing my understanding of what I'm hearing, my reading comprehension scores. There's actually other things that need to go along with that. And so when we're recommending a technology, then when we're recommending this type of technology, we really have to think clearly about that. Because unfortunately, when we look at our IEPs, the way that our IEPs are kind of laid out these days, they're laid out in a way that makes us kind of think, hey, these accommodations, these assistive technologies, these other accommodations, they just kind of, it's like a one size fits all. Hey, you know, if we were having problems with instructions, of course, we're going to do all these things. This is not clear enough. This doesn't get down to the specificity of what we need, of how to link the tool to the skill deficit of a student. And so our IEPs kind of perpetuate some of the challenges that we have in ensuring we're getting the right fit for the technology. Because to get that right fit, what we really need is we need a good classroom teacher who's informed about the technology and their student to make this actually happen. Unfortunately, in Ontario, we have a habit of relying on outside agencies and businesses to be able to do a lot of our assistive technology training, which doesn't actually, that kind of again leads to some of these problems we're running into. What we need is we need classroom teachers to understand who the students are, what are their learning profiles, and by using our curriculum baseline measures, they're going to gain a better understanding of it. Classroom teachers are always also the best people to know the environment that they're in. They need to know, you know, how good's the Wi-Fi? Where are the outlets in the room to be able to ensure the computers are plugged in, or the iPads? How am I delivering information to a student? Am I giving it to them on a piece of paper, or am I using Google Education to be able to deliver it electronically? We have to understand the environmental pieces there. Then we also have to know what tasks do the students typically engage in, and only then can we actually figure out what is the right tool to be able to support that student. So we have to know the student's specific weaknesses, we have to understand the environmental factors coming in, the task that they're having to do, and then we can be able to figure out the tool. And that's why my team at U of T have developed AT Select, which is an online free selection protocol to be able to guide teachers through a process of figuring out what that right tool is. Now, another thing that often we get confused when we're coming to these technologies is this is the technology. So we look at there's so much cool stuff out there that we overload a student. For the vast majority of students who have a reading disability, in word reading or dyslexia, there's actually only one tool they need, and that's a text-to-speech program, the ability to read out loud, because that targets that specific area of weakness that they have, that oral reading fluency or that reading fluency. This bypasses that weakness. I have dyslexia, and I use a free program for all the reading I do every day. I use the free natural reader. I haven't had to spend a cent on text-to-speech for my own personal use because it's free and it does exactly what I needed to do. No other additional buttons, the simple little button to read out loud. This is where we need to get to with our technology. We have to find that right tool, and it has to be easy, and we don't want to add more confusion to the students' learning by having too much of the tools there. And once we find that right tool, then again, it takes a good instructor, a good educator to be able to help that student through in understanding how to implement it. And then on AT Select, for all the assistive technology tools out there, we have kind of these recommendation. So when using text-to-speech, you need to control for the speed. Can't have it reading too fast to the student. You have to make sure that they pause. You can't read like 15 pages straight. Pause at the end of each paragraph. You have to make sure you have a good voice, and you have to make sure the student's actually looking at the screen when the computer's reading out loud. When you do those things, that shows that there's an increase in comprehension. But in addition to just using the accommodation, we still have to bring in remediation. So anytime we think of an accommodation, we have to be also thinking about remediation. So I might be using text-to-speech to be able to help out with oral reading fluency, but I still need to bring in my reading comprehension strategies and be taught how to do those so that I can engage in the higher order skill development. Text-to-speech on its own does not do it. Plus, I still might need to have my vocabulary, and I still need to be given a meaningful text to be able to engage in. The other big thing that's really clear when we look at assistive technology and we talk to teachers and parents and students, when we do surveys and we ask them to list what assistive technology is out there, is there's a misunderstanding of, again, what assistive technology is. Assistive technology is not education technology. So often what we'll hear from students is like, oh yeah, I use assistive technology. I use Prodigy. I love playing Prodigy, or I use Alexia. These are remediation tools. These are actually trying to teach the foundations of numeric operations and kind of phonics and word reading abilities. These are not assistive technologies. Assistive technologies are not strengthening an underlying skill, it's bypassing a skill. So often when I think about assistive technology, I think of the wheelchair. So before the wheelchair was developed, if I had a paraplegic and before the wheelchair was developed, if they had to get from point A to point B, they either had to pull themselves across the ground, a very effortful task, or they needed someone to pick them up and move them from point A to point B, very dependent on someone else. The wheelchair is developed, and then suddenly they're able to move from point A to point B much more efficiently and much more independently. And then we have to change the environment to ensure that student can use that environment. We have to ensure that they have access to buildings by putting in ramps and cuts and curves so that students, the individuals, can use that technology effectively. And that brings me to my next thing, is that a lot of the times with the assistive technology, there are barriers. There's barriers to the implementation of the technology. Internet's a huge one right now. Many schools don't have sufficient bandwidth to be able to use the internet-dependent assistive technology that is commonly used in Ontario. And some students are experiencing 2 minutes plus load-up times to get their computer to work. There's some really good research that shows if it doesn't turn on in 9 seconds, most likely not going to use it again in the future. Another barrier is the stigma, and this was brought up into the Right to Read. Many students feel very stigmatized about the use of the technology within the classroom. And often that stigma is driven from their sense of not understanding why the technology is good for them and seeing how it's actually being able to improve their level of functioning. And so we have to deal with the barriers that are coming up as well. You know, I've talked a lot about assistive technology, but there's a whole bunch of other accommodations out there. There's the non-AT accommodations, which too follow the same principles, that we need to use these in a targeted way. So a scribe is really important for someone who has graphomotor difficulties, so someone who has very poor accuracy and efficiency using the pen to be able to write, or has very poor spelling ability. A scribe is a good accommodation. It's not fixing the problem, it's getting along around the thing. But a scribe has to be paired with remediation at both the transcription level. So we need to teach the student how to type so that one day they're not dependent on a scribe, as well as we have to teach the student the higher order skills of how to generate their ideas, organize those ideas, turn those ideas into sentences and paragraphs, edit that work, and then review it at the very end so that they can become independent. We have to teach those higher order skills. Often we see a lot of grade 12 students, first year university or college students who are coming to us where parents are still scribing for them. They are still completely dependent on someone else to be able to do the work. And we haven't fostered the development of that independence. So we always are thinking about the accommodations are always accommodations plus other remediations. Now, in some cases, for some students, as I said, due to the type of profile that they have, or just due to the lived experiences that, of going through parts of our education system, they have not been able to develop the skills needed to engage in day-to-day work, and therefore we're seeing disengagement, and we're seeing very low motivation in the work that they're doing. And in these cases, then modifications come in. As I said earlier, modifications are about either reducing the amount of expectations or reducing the grade level that we're teaching them at, or reducing the number of expectations that a student has. However, the second we decide to do a modification, the second we do this, we have to only do this after we've tried all other things, because when we start modifying, we create a new learning trajectory that a student is on. And this is known as the performance gap. So in any given year of learning, we have students who acquire about one level of knowledge through it. However, the second we put a student on a modification, the student is not developing the same academic skills, as well as not developing the same curriculum knowledge. And though in 1 year that might not look like a big difference, the cumulative effect of being on modified programs really changes the life trajectory of a student. What we know is these students are not usually able to engage in higher academic work because they don't have the knowledge or the skills to do that. They're often put into applied programming, and with de-streaming coming along, I'm very concerned for our students in those situations. They will not have the knowledge or skills to probably even do that. We even see through the great the OSSLT that we have an increasing number of students who are not engaging within the testing because they don't have sufficient skills to be able to do that. As well as this has a long-term impact on a student's overall life quality of life. We know that the students are more likely to drop out of school. We know that they are more likely to be underemployed or not employed at all, so they're on welfare. And we know that it impacts their general and physical mental health, that they're more likely to report fair to poor general and physical mental health. So having a learning disability and going through a program that often doesn't provide the remediation or remediation plus accommodations, and often relies on modifications to enable a student to engage. What we know is this leads to some pretty profound impacts in students. So modifications are always a last resort. Unfortunately, again, when we look at our kind of IEPs, we often run into some challenges. So currently what we see is we don't have a good, tier 1 approach. We don't often see, or we have ineffective remediation that students are going into. And we can really see this because often the remediations and modifications are being mixed up on a student's IEP. So if we look at the IEP, kind of the special education planner program, often what we see is we see students being modified, they're being given kind of specific information about where their skill levels are, but we don't have evidence-based interventions to try and remediate those issues. They're not targeted interventions that are going on, targeted remediations. And at the end, we don't have very good assessment tools. We're not using kind of the standardized or evidence-based assessment tools to then mark their growth. So when we're putting a student into a modified program, we are really creating an academic performance skill deficit as the students go through. And that's why the modification is a last resort. So often in the system, what we see is we jump down to accommodations then, because we haven't been able to efficiently do this. And we're also modifying at the same time to try and keep students trying to be engaged. And that's what leads to kind of, I think, the situation that Ontario is currently in. The exciting thing is we know what to do. We know how to do good tier 1 interventions. We have the explicit and evidence-based structure as we're hearing. We have fantastic remediation programs, and we understand the balance between accommodations and remediations to ensure that students can engage. And in doing all this, I think the number of students who need modified programs in the future will continue to go down and go down and go down as we become more efficient at being able to help students engage in the learning. And with early intervention and screening and early intervention, I do think that we will slowly see a change in the number of students who need special ed resources. I think we'll also see a difference in the number of students who probably qualify for needing actually psychological assessments to be able to diagnose them with learning disabilities or dyslexia. Because if we do it right, if we do it based on what the science is saying, the education system itself will be remediating the vast majority of these students so that they'll no longer need to require alternative programming. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Todd. It's been so busy on the chat because so many people are nodding their heads and so grateful for the clarification and the support you've provided and your contributions to help us make a difference following the recommendations of the OHRC's Right to Read report has been essential to us. Thank you so much.